Can you hear me on the mic? We're going to get started. Got a lot of material to cover. So we could get started. And will someone start us in prayer this week? Roger, you will?
Sure.
Okay, Roger.
Lord, we come before you with grateful hearts. We thank you for your love, for your goodness, for the gift of your Son and your holy word, Lord, that gives us the opportunity to understand and learn how we are to live our lives. Pray that we would be guided by that we would focus upon you daily. I thank you for Kevin and the efforts that he's put into preparing this study, and pray that as we come away that we would have a clearer understanding of Revelation. Give you the praise for who you are in this day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, we're taking this side trip in the book of Daniel. And like I've said, you can't understand Revelation unless you understand Daniel. Okay? And so where we left off last time is we said, unless you know Daniel, you don't understand the timetables in Revelation. But you know a lot of things in Revelation. There's a number of times it talks about the 1,260 days or the time and a half, and it talks about some of that, but it never says anything about the 7 years or anything like that. So in the book of Daniel is where that comes from. So you have to understand what Daniel says in those books so you can understand the time, okay? And also, what I didn't mention before, you need to understand the events of Revelation by what is prophesied in Daniel. Because Daniel lays out all this amazing, amazing stuff. And it's all prophecy. And remember what we say about prophecy, that prophecy has to come to pass, because if it doesn't, then God is a liar, and therefore it must happen. So we're going to start out with this first chart here. Oop. I think I went one too many. Come on, chart. Oh, I don't have the charts in there. So make sure I have the right charts here. Oh, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with this big picture chart. So this big picture chart, which I showed you before, is basically showing you all the prophets from the time of David and Solomon and the king, which it's called the United Kingdom, that 120 years where each of those three kings was king for exactly 40 years. And then northern Israel, remember, is there for a while and then goes into captivity in 722, and Judah's in all this time. But I wanted you to notice that we're in the book of Daniel right here during the exile. Remember, during the exile, Daniel's there, and he's in the palace with the king. And Ezekiel's by the canal outside the palace. He's with the common people. Okay? And then I just showed you this map. I want to show you this map real quick because it shows you Babylon over here in Chaldea, or where the Chaldeans live, okay? Okay? So you have over here Israel, okay? There's Jerusalem right there and the Dead Sea, see all that? And always when Daniel's over there in Babylon, remember when they captured Jerusalem, they go back over this way and they go over to Babylon. And Daniel and Ezekiel are over there because in 605 BC is when Daniel and all of the other people were taken over there. Yes, sir?
Is Shinar the whole thing?
Shinora?
Yeah, the top, the land.
Shinar, yeah.
Is that the whole thing?
It's another name for that whole area, Shinar, okay? Okay? So Babylon is Ur of the Chaldeans, which relates to Abraham. Don't you think that's interesting? That's where Abraham's from, the same place. Mesopotamia, that's this area right here. See, it says right there. Euphrates River, that's right here. And the Tigris River, it's all right here in the Persian Gulf. That's all where they were in that general area there. And then Jeremiah's over here, and Ezekiel and Daniel are over here, okay? Okay, so just like this statement here, you must understand what the prophet said in the Old Testament to understand Revelation. I mean, duh. You got to know those things. And then you're reading through the Bible and you know all these things that the prophet said, and you get to the Gospels and you get to the New Testament, you get the writings of Paul, and finally you get to the book of Revelation. But you have to carry all of that information forward. So you have to make a decision about all these different prophecies. Are they going to come true? Or are they not going to come true? What are those prophecies? What do those prophecies say? Do they apply to the Israel? Do they apply to the Gentiles? Do they apply to which people group? Why do they apply to each people group? So to do that, you have to go into the book of Daniel and you have to find those things out. So I say, unless you know and believe what the Old Testament prophets said and promised about what will take place in the latter days, what will take place in the future, at the end time, at the end of the age, in the day of the Lord. You have to believe those things, you have to trust in those things, and you have to know what they are, right? You can't trust in things unless you know what they are. So that's why we're going into the book of Daniel, so we can find out some of these things. And then another point, overlapping to some of my earlier statements, all prophecy must be fulfilled. There's no exceptions. God said it, it must be fulfilled. Why? Because the Lord established it, accomplished it, spoke it, will bring it to pass, because the Lord willed it, planned it, purposed it, and surely will do it. That's why. And you're saying, well, I'm still not sure about it. Well, in the same passage it says, all prophecy according to God's purpose and good pleasure and God's will, because the Lord prophesies, declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things that have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. In this same Isaiah 46 that's up here, it's actually within that passage right there. So you have to decide. You have to say yes, or you have to say no. You have to decide. Okay? So back to our notes here. In the middle of the page there, I have the outline of Daniel. I did a quick outline of that. And you notice the areas I highlighted. So our study in Daniel is going to be, we are going to focus on Daniel chapter 2 and 7 this week. And next week, we're going to focus on Daniel chapter 9 and 12. And then we'll have a good understanding of Daniel, especially the time elements and the end time elements. Okay? So we're starting in Daniel chapter 2, which we're doing this morning. So if you want to turn there, if you have your Bible or whatever. So in chapter 2, Daniel has a dream. Daniel has a dream. I mean, and Daniel's dream is actually Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But Nebuchadnezzar's dream is in chapter 2, and Daniel's dream is in chapter 7, and they somewhat, in many ways, overlap the same things. So Daniel 2, verses 1 through 3. So does someone want to read those 3 verses for me?
In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. The king commanded that the magicians and enchanters and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream.
Okay. So this is the introduction to chapter 2, and then I'm going to leave off verses 4 through 15 because I couldn't figure out how to get everything in there this week and do 2 full chapters. But basically in the following verses is where the Chaldeans and the magicians and all that have this interaction with the king and all that, and you can read that on your own. But to really get to the meat of chapter 2, we're going to move on to verses 16 through 19. Does someone want to read those 3 verses?
Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation of the king. And Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning the mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon.
Okay, did you do 19?
Nope. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and then Daniel blessed the God of heaven.
Okay, so you notice in this bottom of the page the things I have highlighted in yellow in there. And so it's all about the interpretation. So there's the dream, there's the interpretation, the king wants to know it. And then it moves down into those verses we just read. Daniel wants to declare the interpretation of the king. And then, but in verse 19, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And God blessed, and then Daniel blessed God for that. So moving on to the next page. So what we're doing is we're seeking the interpretation of the dream, but we don't even know what the dream is yet, right? We don't know yet. So the next page, Daniel understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Well, how do we know that? In verse 17, it says, as for these 4 youths, this is chapter 1, Daniel, and there's the different names for Daniel and his companions. Remember, they each had a Babylonian name and a Hebrew name, right? So like Daniel's Hebrew name is Daniel, and then his Babylonian name is Belshazzar, okay? So God gave him knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So way back in chapter 1, it already said that he understood visions and dreams. But as you'll see, the pattern is always he understands them because he prays to God, and God reveals those things to him. Then he reveals those things to whoever is in that particular chapter or event. So moving to Daniel 2:24 here, I'll go through this because I want to go through it slowly so to make sure we understand. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, who the king appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. Remember, that's one of the king's assistants. And he went and spoke to him as follows: do not destroy the wise men. Take me to the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation. So Daniel's telling this guy he's going to declare the interpretation. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. The king said to Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answered before the king and said, for the mystery, now they're calling this sometimes a mystery and sometimes a dream or a vision. It still means the same thing, but it's the mystery of the dream and the vision, okay? As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, or diviners are able to declare it. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. Notice when I have this highlighted in this lavender color, that's whenever it's referring to the latter days. It's referring to the end times, okay? This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were in your bed. As for you, O king, while you're in your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future. Okay? And he, God, who reveals mystery, has made to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. It's an interesting statement of the purpose of the dream. So you, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and extraordinarily splendor, and was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breasts and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And you, king, continued looking until the stone was cut out without hands, and it, the stone, struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, clay, the bronze, the silver, and gold were crushed, all four at the same time, and they became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them all away, so that not a trace of them was found, but the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Well, I want to know what that's all about, okay? So Daniel is telling this king all this stuff, okay? They have this interaction in those verses we just read. And then we have the statue. Here's some artist depicts it as something like this, okay? With the different parts of the statue as described in the verses. And then at the very end, the last thing we read was about how the stone comes down, and it doesn't hit this part of the statue. It hits the feet, okay? It hits the feet. It hits the lower part. So this tells us what the dream was, but it doesn't tell us the interpretation of the dream, and that's why we're going to the next page. So I'm going to read through this one too, so I can emphasize some of the main points. Daniel 2:36. This was a dream. Now we will tell its interpretation. It even says that right in the verse. We want to know the interpretation. It says right in the verse. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven was given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. Now, wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he, God, has given them into your hand and caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. This is really interesting to me because this overlaps in Romans 13, okay? Because in Romans 13 and verse 1, remember how it talks about all nations and governments were established by God? Here's a government established by God, and what's interesting about it, it says in these verses, God gave it to Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And then it also says God caused it to happen. Don't you think that's interesting? Okay? That's really insightful, I think. So verse 39, after you, there will arise another kingdom inferior or lesser to you. Then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, as much as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks things in pieces, it will crush and break all of these, meaning these four pieces, okay? And in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of the potter's clay and partly of iron. Now we're starting to get into the 10 toe kingdoms, okay? And they're down here, and we're going to have a chart on this, but they're down here on the chart. Remember, that's where the stone hits, okay? In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. The toe kings, will be a divided kingdom, but the toe kingdoms will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as ye saw the iron mixed with the common clay. As the toes of feet are partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom, meaning the 10 toe kingdoms, will be strong, and part of it will be brittle. In that you saw the iron mixed with the common clay, they, meaning the 10 toe kingdoms, will combine with one another in the seed of man. Meaning it has to do with men, not toes, okay? It has to do with kingdoms and people, okay? And we're going to see way more of that in the next page or two here. In the days of those kings, meaning the 10 toe kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, God's kingdom, which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom, God's kingdom, will not be left for another people. And it, meaning the stone that comes down and crushes the feet, okay, will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, meaning the 10 toe kingdoms. But it, God's kingdom, will itself endure forever. So all of a sudden he inserts this forever kingdom in there. Finally, inasmuch as you saw a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. So you're going, what does that have to do with stones without hands? What that means, without man's hands doing it, okay? And that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and gold, all 5. And the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. Okay, that's key. We'll keep talking about the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Oh, so Daniel thought what God told him is true and trustworthy, just like we should find what God says is true and trustworthy. We're going to go to the next chart here. We're going to talk about the toes. I love talking about toes, don't you? Toes, okay? So there's where he just said all this stuff again. It's the same chart, but it's those passages we just revealed, okay? So we're going to get into the statue's toes because we want to make sure we understand what those are, okay? We want to understand what those are and how they apply to prophecy, how they apply to the future, and as best as we can, who those 10 kings are, at least their purpose, maybe not the name of every king, but we're going to find out a lot about them, okay? So here we have all these 10 toes here. So at the bottom of the page, in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. So you see their artists tried to depict it being those two together. So the 10 toes represent 10 kings. How do you know that? Because verse 44 says so. The 10 kings will be crushed by the stone. How do we know that? Because verse 44 says so. And the stone is the Messiah who will come and crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. We know that from verses 34, 35, and 44 that I have listed there. So the days of those kings, those 10 toe kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Oh, has God set up a kingdom that's never been destroyed yet? No, not the kingdom where he crushes all the kingdoms and puts them in, not in that sense. But I know what you're saying, but it's not in the same sense, okay? Okay, so the Messiah who will come and set up God's kingdom will endure forever, verse 44, and all this will take place in the future. So in the future, the stone will come, crush the feet, which is the 10 toes, which is the 10 kings. He will crush it and have this everlasting forever kingdom will occur. So we'll go to the next. So before we get into this list here a little bit, at the top, God has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. So we're talking about the latter days. God, who reveals mysteries, made known to the king what will take place in the future. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future in those different verses. So 3 different verses talk about these latter days and the future. So now we're going to go through these 6 kingdoms. Well, 6 kingdoms? I don't remember 6. Well, let's go through them and I'll show you. First, we see the head of the statue is made of gold. And the interpretation of that is the Babylonian Empire, or Nebuchadnezzar, is the head of gold. Okay? Because he said, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. So we know for sure who the head of gold is, right? We know for sure. Second, we see the statue's breast and arms of silver. The interpretation is, after you, king, there will arise another king inferior or lesser to you. So we're going to identify this one here in a minute. Third, we'll see a statue's belly and thighs of bronze, another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth. So all of these kingdoms are going to rule over the earth, rule over the earth, rule over the earth, okay? Fourth, its statue, the legs of iron. There will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, as much as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks things in pieces, it, meaning that kingdom, will crush and break all these 4 other kingdoms before, okay? Fifth kingdom. We see its statue's feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Interpretation in that you saw the feet of toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It, meaning the 10-toe kingdoms, will be a divided kingdom. But it, the 10-toe kingdom, will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery. So notice it says clay, and sometimes it says pottery. It says clay and pottery are tied together, right? You need one for the other. So some of the kingdom, the 10-toe kingdoms, will be strong, and part of it, the 10-toe kingdom, will be brittle. Oh, how does that work? In that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they, the 10-toe kingdoms, will combine one another in the seed of man. So it's about men. That's what it's talking about. When you say the seed of man, you're talking about the descendants or men. But they, the 10-toe kingdom, would not adhere to each other, not combine into one. So if you were to take a chunk of clay and a chunk of iron, and even if you melted them down, they don't mix together. You can't stir them up and make clay and iron soup or whatever. It's got to, no matter what you do, if you poured them into a mold or whatever, they would be all separate, like that kind of thing. They would be in there, but they wouldn't be mixed together. So in this prophecy is giving you an analogy of that, how they don't combine with each other. Because it even says, that last part of the verse, 43, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Oh, I see. See? So he's trying to explain to you what that means. That's the interpretation. So we're going to go to the 6th kingdom here. We see the stone that struck the statue became a mountain. Well, we know from Scripture that mountains are kingdoms, and maybe we can go into that a little more at some point, and filled the whole earth. Oh, this kingdom filled the whole earth. That's a lot. As revealed, okay, so I have it broken down in these 3 areas: as revealed, as interpreted, and in a summation of that. So as revealed, the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, gold are crushed. Then, in order, a stone struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay. So remember the other one, the stone comes down and crushes all these right here. Crushes all those. Oh, excuse me. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain kingdom and filled the whole earth. So the stone became a kingdom that filled the whole earth, and that kingdom will last forever, the forever kingdom. As interpreted, in the days of those kings, the 10-toe kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, like I just said. He'll set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And that kingdom, God's kingdom, will not be left for another people. It, the stone, God's kingdom, will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, these 10-toe kingdoms. But it, God's kingdom will itself endure forever. There we are. That's right in the verses. I'm not making this up. It just basically says it there in different words than I used, but it's there. So then, in verse 45, it summarizes the whole thing. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, not by men, okay, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, all 5 of them. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, okay? So the dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. So let's go to the next page here. I'm moving fast because there's a lot of stuff in here. So we're going to go to this next chart. It's got a lot of stuff on it. So remember, we keep working with this statue with the different metals that represent different kingdoms. And then remember, the stone comes down and crushes this one. Okay, so we know about the Babylonian kingdom. It was at the time of David. When he's alive, he's in the Babylonian kingdom with King Nebuchadnezzar. So we know that's a kingdom, and that's kind of a duh, you know? It's kind of a duh. And so it was fulfilled in history, and it's all about the Gentiles. Why did you write Gentiles in there? Why did I put Gentiles in there? Because what is a Gentile? Anything that's not a Jew, right? Any person on earth that's not a Jew is a Gentile, right? So the Babylonians were a Gentile nation that came in and conquered Israel, remember, at the exile. Okay? So it's important to understand why that word Gentile's in there. Then we have the Medo-Persian Empire, and we'll show reference to that even in Daniel, because in Daniel, Belshazzar, when he had the writing on the wall prophecy in chapter 5, what happens in the middle of his party, he's in the big palace and with all the big walls around it and everything. And that very night, okay, the Persians come in and conquer him. So right in Daniel, we get the second kingdom right there, the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, that's a Gentile empire also, too. It's not Israel, right? It's a Gentile. Third, we get the Grecian Empire, okay? Now, the Grecian Empire is talked about in Daniel also, in the later chapters, especially chapter 11, okay? It's a Gentile nation too, and remember the Grecian one is Alexander the Great, remember? He conquers the whole world. He takes out the Medo-Persian Empire and brings in the Grecian Empire, right? And so we could talk about that for a long time, but then we have the Roman Empire. History of the United Roman Empire was also a Gentile empire. Well, we know a lot about the Roman Empire, right? So there's different dates about exactly when that started, but I just put this same date right here, which is before Christ, remember? About 168 years before Christ. It was a Gentile kingdom, and we know a lot about the Roman Empire because they were in power during the time of Christ, during the Gospels, and we know all that. And then there's this gap of time. Well, where does it say there's a gap of time? It doesn't ever say there's a gap of time. How do you know there's a gap of time? Well, because I'm saying in the days of those kings in verse 44 that we just read, remember? This is just one evidence. There's more evidence. This is one evidence. Gap of time is the time of those kings. What is the time of those kings? What happens at the time of those kings? The stone comes down and crushes the 10 kings, right? And then we read about 3 times that that's in the future. That's in the latter days. Okay, so in the latter days, in the future is when the stone comes, Messiah comes and destroys the feet, destroys the 10 toes, destroys the 10 kings. Okay, destroys all those things. And finally, there's the 10-toe kings right there. That's in the future. How do I know it's in the future? Because I keep reading you those same verses, right? I read them like 3 times. It's in the future. It's the 5th kingdom. It's what I call the divided toe empires. The time of the toe empires. The time of the 10-toe empires. Those 10-toe empires are Gentile empires too. They're not Israel. They're not Israel. Finally, the sixth kingdom that I read on the previous page, the everlasting kingdom, God sets up a kingdom that will endure forever, take place in the future. Has that happened? No. No future kingdom has occurred yet where God comes down, crushes all the Gentile kingdoms, destroys them all, sets up a kingdom that lasts forever. That hasn't happened yet. But we know it's going to happen. Why? Because all prophecy comes true, and because Daniel is the prophet, and because it was revealed to him by God in these different ways.
Kevin,
Yeah.
what do you think of the idea that in some degree that we are still in the age of the Roman Empire because of the influence it had over the world, that it's still influencing us even in this time?
Oh, well,
Because I've
if
heard that.
if you look in a history book, it always says it ended at a specific date. Maybe not the exact date that
So I know, yes, the rule in the sense of Rome, but the influence of the,
Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire still in a sense is, I don't know, it's
Could
just.
you extend that analogy though to the Greek Empire? Because a lot of what the Romans did was all influenced by the Greeks, and still like what we do today is also greatly influenced by Greek culture.
So yeah, that's a
Just keep going back and back and back.
yeah. So that's a really good point. So if you want to talk about it in that sense that you're talking about, when the Roman Empire was established, what language did they bring in? The Greek language. It was like, why did they bring the Greek language? Why don't they do their own, right? Then eventually they developed their own. That's what Latin is. Latin is the Roman language. So they bring in these Greek ideas. They bring in Greek philosophy. They bring in all this Greek stuff, like you mentioned, okay? So they bring it in, and it's definitely an influence. But I would basically say that although Greek philosophy and the Roman philosophy or Roman thinking or Greek thinking is still today. I even read an article in the last 6 months that said one of the most common things taught to young people in universities today is Greek philosophy. It's like, oh, interesting. Now, they don't teach religion, right? But they teach Greek philosophy, right? So you get introduced to that, okay? So we'll go to the next slide here. So this is just a reminder of the 10-toe kingdoms. The stone that struck the statue became a great mountain kingdom and filled the whole earth. So how do we know the first four parts of the statue represent a later historic empire or kingdom? Well, I kind of explained that, but first of all, we know that the world empire was in the time of David, and each succeeding empire that conquered each preceding empire according to the secular and biblical resources. So not only Bible scholars believe that, but secular scholars believe those empires existed, okay? First, we know the head of gold represent a Babylonian empire. Second, we know the breasts and arms of silver represent the Medo-Persian empire. Third, we know the belly and thighs of bronze represent the Grecian Empire. Fourth, we know the legs of iron represent the Roman Empire as an empire after Greece. In those verses there. So how do we know the feet and toes of statues represent a future 10 kings or 10 empires? We want to try the best we can identify them. We know from Daniel 2:44 that God will send a stone, will crush and put an end to all of these 10-toe kingdoms. So first you got to find the kings so they can get crushed, right? So you have to somehow identify who those 10 kings are, or at least try to understand who they are so that they can get crushed. But even if you did find them, you got to also find that they were crushed by the stone that came from heaven, okay? So that God will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and it's God's kingdom in itself will endure forever. Therefore, God has not yet set up a forever kingdom, and therefore the 10 kings don't exist yet to be crushed, right? So that's evidence for it being future. Moving down there in verse 44, in the days of those kings, the 10 kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. And at the stone, God's kingdom will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, or the 10-toe kingdoms. But it, God's kingdom will itself endure forever. So this is repeating what I've read a couple times before to show you why I think the 10-toe kingdoms are in the far future from the time of Daniel, because Daniel's in the middle of the exile, right? He's alive in the middle of the exile. Finally, the question 3, are there other references to these 10 kings in prophecy? Okay. I say yes. So I think the key places are Revelation 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17. Okay? So we keep reading this verse 42, partly of clay and partly of pottery, strong like iron. So you have the toes of the feet. Be a divided kingdom. In other words, they kind of don't get along and will be separated somehow, which we're going to talk about today. Okay? Toes will be a divided, partly of iron, some of king. So remember that the iron and clay don't mix. The 10 kings don't mix. The 10 kings don't get along. The 10 kings are divided. Okay?
It sounds exactly like Europe. The way you're describing it, I could see the parallels. Like it's almost like perfectly with the way Europe is set up.
Yeah, so a lot of people, and we haven't got to that yet, but a lot of people say, oh, well, there's a 10 federation of European nations, and at some point, the stone will come and destroy them because they represent them, but that's a good point. So, these are the key passages if you want to know about the 10-toe kings, okay? These are the key passages in this chart here. I have sound effects on all of my slides, but I didn't know they were going to be turned on. But so you got the horns making noise and the crowns making noise. I have this problem where sometimes I get into detail and I want to, do the next thing, So Daniel 2 is where we're studying, and now this morning we're going to study Daniel 7. We won't have time for Revelation 13. We'll study that when we get to Revelation 13, okay? And then finally, the fourth place is Revelation 17, about the kings and all of that. Okay, so my point is this. So you have to understand this and feel okay with it. You have to say, well, the 10 toes are the same as the 10 horns in these passages. And if the 10 horns are kings, like it says in verse 44, those representing kings, and the 10 horns are 10 kings in Daniel 7, and the 10 horns are 10 diadems, crowns, and if you can bridge that gap and say that means kings too, because the diadems represent crowns. And also it says in Revelation 17, the 10 horns represent kings. So I'm thinking toes and horns represent kings because of these 4 places. Okay? Go to the next page. Now we are jumping to Daniel chapter 7. So you might want to turn there in your Bible. I couldn't decide if I was going to try to do 2 chapters in one morning, but we'll see if I make it through. But it's so important to tie these 2 together because they overlap. A lot of their prophecy overlaps, as you'll see. Daniel 7, verse 1. I call this the summary revealed by Daniel because it says that in verse 1, it calls it a summary. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, so now we're jumping to 553 BC, okay, middle of the exile still. Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on the bed, and he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. So in this passage, Daniel has the dream. In chapter 2, Belshazzar has the dream. You see the difference there? Daniel said, I was looking in a vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, meaning the Mediterranean. If you look at those verses, there's a number of places in Scripture that refer the great sea as the Meridian Sea, which is there by Israel. And the 4 great beasts were coming out from the sea, different from one another. The first beast was like a lion and had wings of an eagle. And it kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it. So it had some sort of uniqueness to it, okay? And it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the 10 horns, behold, another horn, the little one, came up among them, among the 10 horns. The 10 horns, the 10 toes, right? Remember we related those? The 3 of the first 10 horns were pulled out of the roots before it. And behold, this little horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and mouth like a mouth uttering great boasts. So this is an artist's depiction of basically what he tried to see here. This artist decided there. It's pretty cool looking creatures, don't you think? Man, I kind of think they look like a sci-fi movie. Like Godzilla meets King Kong or something, but... So we'll go on the next page, verse 9. So all of a sudden we're in this different scene. We're like, oh, wait a minute, I want to know more about the horn and all that, right? So we'll go to this right here. So all of a sudden it just switches scenes, okay? I kept looking until the thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his vesture was like white snow. Oh, we read about that in Revelation chapter 1, didn't we? And the hair of his head was pure wool, and his throne was a blaze of flames, and his wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him, and the court sat, and the books were open. It was like, well, no, I want to find out more about the beast. It's like, no, I want to take a side trip. We're going to say the side trip to heaven, take you to heaven, and show you this, okay? So here below on that next part here, I try to explain some things. The scene switches from speaking of the little horn to the Ancient of Days sitting on his throne in a court where books are opened, which implies judging. This may be when the little horn will be judged and his dominion taken away and destroyed. It doesn't say that, but it follows what was just said about him that way. This closely parallels the great white throne judgment in Revelation 20. So if you're familiar with Revelation 20, remember that's the great white throne judgment where unbelievers are judged from the books and the book of life, and all were thrown into the lake of fire. This is after the millennial kingdom. Moving down, Daniel verse 11 of chapter 7. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the little horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast, the little horn, was slain, and the little horn's body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the 4 beast empires, their dominion was taken away, but the extension of life was granted to them. Oh, we left heaven again. We got back to the horns and the beasts. Oh my gosh. Come on, Daniel, make it easy on us. But he doesn't. He wants to switch back and forth. So the scene switches again from speaking of the Ancient of Days to the little horn in the latter days. The little horn of the beast is the beast or the Antichrist. We know it is the beast or the Antichrist because, if you looked at those verses, you could see it's the same. And the rest of the four beast empires refers to the three beasts, the lion, bear, and the leopard, which are also the statue empires of gold, silver, and bronze that we just studied a few minutes ago. So here's a reference in Revelation 13 that I think helps us to understand. And there was given to him, now we're talking about the little horn now that we just read about here, a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemy, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. Oh, in Revelation, sounds very much like Daniel, right? Very much like Daniel. And he, the beast, opened his mouth and blasphemies against God. Oh, that's what we just read in Daniel, blasphemies against God, same thing. To blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and that is those who dwell in heaven. So in Revelation, it says that he's going to blaspheme everybody in heaven and the God of heaven and everything. Man, that's a lot of boastful talk, isn't it? Revelation 19, the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshiped his image. Okay? These two, the beast and the false prophet, were thrown in the lake of fire, burns with brimstone. Oh, this sounds like Daniel 7 we just read, right? That he will be thrown into the lake of fire at some point in the future in Revelation. Go to the next page. See if we turn this page. There is the artist's depiction of these 10 horns. Remember, there's 10 horns, and it implies that all the horns are pretty much the same. And then this little horn comes out and becomes the dominant horn, right? And he's speaking boastful words, right? I am God, I am in control, and insults God and all those in heaven. Oh, so just when we got used to being back about talking about the little horn, we're going to switch again and forget the little horn for a minute and talk about something else. In verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, behold, the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and came with the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and kingdom, and all the peoples, nations, men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one to not be destroyed. Didn't we just read about a kingdom that will last forever, that will not be destroyed? We just read that in chapter 2, right? The scene switches from speaking of the little horn to the Father giving everlasting dominion and kingdom to the Son of Man. It's switched. There's like, but I just want to know about the little horn, you know? Remember how all heaven and earth proclaimed how worthy the Lamb was in Revelation 5. Remember a couple weeks ago we did Revelation 5, and all the myriads and myriads of angels were kept saying, you know, glory and honor and worthy is the Lamb. We went through that in great detail. So Daniel 7, verse 15. Let's see if we have a... Oh, there's the beast, right? So this artist has this beast with the 10 horns, and he comes out of the sea. And then he's got 10 horns, and then the little horn comes out of him. But first, we'll read through this. Verse 15, and as for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions of my mind kept alarming me. Yeah, I think you'd be pretty rattled too if you saw this stuff yourself, right? I approached one of those angels who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So the angel's going to reveal the interpretation. Pretty interesting, huh? And these 4 great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom. Well, how did the saints get in here, man? I mean, it's like, why did he switch to talking about the saints? And possess the kingdom forever for all ages. Oh, so what I'm thinking is the saints are going to possess the kingdom for all ages to come. That not only means the saints that Daniel knew about, but includes us, right? We'll receive the everlasting kingdom. He just slips that in there. Seems out of context. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from the others. Exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remaining 3 kings with his feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns which were on its head. And the other horn, meaning the little horn, which came up before the 3 of them, fell. Namely, the little horn, which had eyes and mouth of great boast. Remember, we just read that in verse 8 and 11. In which the little horn was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and that little horn, was waging war with the saints and overpowering him. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. I desire to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast. Okay? So what's interesting here, do you notice that it talks about the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom? And remember up in verse 17, or verse 18, the saints of the highest heaven will receive the kingdom. Have we received the kingdom yet? No. Have we received the everlasting kingdom? For all ages to come, have we received it? No, not yet.
Yes, if your name is written in the book of life of the Lamb.
That means you will receive it, but you haven't received it yet.
Yes, but the name already there in the heaven. All that was written in the book of life, it's already in heaven.
Yeah, it's written in heaven that you will receive it. Future tense is will. Yeah. But I know what you're saying. That's a good point. I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the meaning of the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn, meaning and I'm starting to call it the 11th horn, okay, which had eyes and mouth uttering great boasts, okay. And so we'll go to the next page. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom, possess the kingdom forever at all ages to come. Remember, I keep emphasizing that. And then I jumped to verse 21. I kept looking, and that horn, the 11th horn, was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed on favor of the saints of the highest one. The time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Have the saints taken possession of the kingdom yet? Have we physically gone into this future kingdom yet? No. We have not physically, but do we know what it's going to be like? That's the New Jerusalem at the end of Revelation. Remember in chapter 22, when it comes down out of heaven, it says you will possess the kingdom, and there'll be no more tears, no more death, no more curse, all those things. It gives you a big, huge list of all those things. Okay, it's really important. So there I just show on the sheet again the beast with the 10 horns and the little horn. I'm calling him the 11th horn that comes out. Sometimes he's called the another king. He doesn't say one of the 10 kings was transformed into a king. It says another king. So a lot of times they call him the 11th king, and that's what I'm calling him. Verse 23. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on earth, which will be different from the other kingdoms, and the fourth kingdom will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns out of this fourth kingdom, the 10 kings will arise. Oh, so you have to understand that the Roman Empire, remember in the statue, the legs, the calves, and the feet were of iron. But the legs and the calves refer to the Roman Empire that's already existed. according to those dates, starting before the time of Christ up to 400 and what I wrote is 476 AD, so for like 500 or 600 years. Okay? As for the 10 hordes out of this kingdom, 10 kings will arise, and another, meaning the 11th king, will arise from them. And he, that 11th king, will be different from the previous ones, and that 11th king will subdue 3 kings. So you have the 10 horns, kings. Another king comes out, the 11th one, okay? He will subdue 3 of the horns, 3 of the kings. He will subdue 3 of them. Okay? 3 of the 10 kings. He, that 11th king, will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he, that king, will intend to make alterations in times and law. And they, meaning the saints, will be given into his hand for time and a half. Okay, so we know from time and a half, so everybody agrees that refers to 3.5 years. Okay? And that's repeated a number of times in Scripture, not only in Daniel, but also in Revelation chapter 12 and 13, which I have listed there. But the court will set up for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. So this is another place where I'm kind of thinking, back when it was talking about, I showed you the throne room when the judgment and the books were open, that it might refer to this time when the 11th king his dominion will be taken away. Then the sovereignty and the dominion and greatness of all kingdoms under the whole earth will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. So here we have it again, the third time, about the saints receiving the kingdom. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all his dominions will serve and obey him. When has that happened? Not happened yet. Okay, so it's future. So at this point, the revelation ended, and as for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So the meaning of the fourth beast in the latter days, the Roman iron, clay, feet, toes empire. So remember the main statue had the iron thighs and legs down here, and then the feet were down below, and they were iron too, and they were part of that same Roman Empire. But we keep learning that was later on, that part of the Roman Empire is later on. And that's where people in prophecy get the idea that, there'll be this revived Roman Empire at the end time. That's where they get that idea, okay? Which I think is valid. I mean, if you relate it to Daniel, it's valid, okay? So the fourth beast refers back to the Roman iron legs and forward to the Roman iron clay feet, toes. Okay? In that verse there. So iron, clay, feet, toes kingdom will have 10 kings with 11 kings that subdues 3 of the 10 kings. That 11th king will speak against the Most High, and the saints will be given into his hand for 3.5 years or 42 months. Revelation 13. And the 11th king is the beast having 10 horns with diadems and 7 heads in Revelation 13. And we'll turn the page. And this is those verses. Revelation 13, there was given to him, the beast or the little horn, a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. That's just what it said in Daniel. An authority to act for 42 months, just what it said in Daniel. And he, the beast, opened his mouth in blasphemies against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Revelation 13:1, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore and saw a beast coming out of the sea having 10 horns and 7 heads, and his 10 horns were 10 diadems, and on his 7 heads were blasphemous names. Okay, so this is where we try to relate the beast of Daniel with the beast of Revelation, okay? You have to bridge that gap. You have to feel comfortable with that. because they're both called beasts, but that doesn't guarantee you it's the same one. But if it's the same one in the same kind of context about these 10 kings, about these 10 diadems or crowns, is in the same context as the 10 toes, which is in the same context as the 10 horns, that's where you get this beast being the same one as Revelation. So the meaning of the 10 horns, in those days, those 10 kings, when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom never destroyed, will take place in the latter days. So that's in prophecy where you bridge the gap and say, oh, this is when it occurs in the latter days. As for the 10 horns, out of this fourth kingdom, 10 kings will arise. We read that in Daniel 7. We read that twice in Daniel 7. We read it in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, like I listed there. Revelation 17 says, because we haven't read that verse yet, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not received a kingdom. Oh, that's pretty clear, isn't it? That's real clear. 10 kings. But they, the 10 kings, receive authority as kings with the beast, the little horn, for 1 hour. These 10 kings have one purpose, and they, the 10 kings, give their power and authority to the beast. So remember what we read is the little horn comes up and overpowers the other kings, takes out 3 of them, so there's only 7 left. And then the 7 are loyal to that 11th king. And that 11th king is the little horn, is the beast, is the Antichrist. See, you have to relate how those all go together. So the meaning of another king, the 11th king in the latter days, the little horn in that's mentioned in Daniel 7:8 that I wrote there. As for the 10 horns, out of this fourth kingdom, 10 kings will arise, and another horn will arise after them. And he, that 11th king, will be different from the previous ones. So I'm rereading part of Daniel here. And that 11th king will subdue the 3 kings. Remember, we read that. And he, the 11th king, will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. And he, that king, will intend to make alterations in times of law, and these saints will give into his hand for 3.5 years. Okay? So in Revelation, there's 3 places that talk about the 3.5 years, right? So a lot of people say, oh, well, that 3.5 years is the greatest part of the tribulation or the great tribulation or the last 3.5 years. And it mentions that in Revelation in those verses I have listed there. But then it says, the court will sit for judgment, and the 11th kingdom will be taken away and annihilated, destroyed forever. So this, in a nutshell, is what happens in Revelation, right? So in Revelation, these 10 kings rise, and then there's a bunch of chapters and chapters and chapters. And then at the end, what happens? The beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. But first, they're thrown into the pit, right? Temporarily bound for 1,000 years. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, it says in Revelation 20, they're brought out. And then they're thrown into the lake of fire, right? They're the first to go in there. Then another horn in Daniel 7:24 is one of the same fourth beast, one in the same fourth beast. So the fourth beast in Daniel 7:23 is one of the same beasts in Revelation 13 in those verses, as we mentioned above on this page. So the beast in Revelation 13 is one in the Antichrist, is one and the same as the Antichrist in Revelation. So how do we know about the Antichrist? Because it doesn't use the word Antichrist. So one of the main verses you get that is 1 John 2:18 that I have there. Children, it's the last hour, just as you heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many antichrists have appeared. From this point, we know that it is the last hour. Okay? So in the New Testament, it starts talking about the Antichrist and uses the term Antichrist. But in Daniel, it doesn't use that term. It uses the term little horn and beast. So the Antichrist is coming, the final world ruler, according to the activity of Satan in 2 Thessalonians, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or act of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself to be God, 2 Thessalonians. The Antichrist will seek to replace and oppose the true Christ. The Antichrist, the little horn, the fourth beast, the man of lawlessness, the son of destruction, and the beast. Those are all the names for the Antichrist. There might be some more, but those are the key ones in those verses. So we'll go to the last page. Looks like I might actually get through this in time. It's amazing. Okay. So I have this chart here. So we just studied chapter 2 and chapter 7, right? Chapter 2, chapter 7. Here's chapter 2. Here's chapter 7. So I want to make sure you understand that chapter 7 is talking about the same kingdoms as mentioned in chapter 2. Okay? So we just studied these 4 kingdoms right here in those verses, and these small horn and the 10 horn kingdoms, right? And then in chapter 2 that we started out this morning with, you, king, are the head of gold in that verse, the silver, the bronze, and the 4th kingdom, the crusher of iron. And so remember, I keep talking about this part of the legs, the iron legs, that part of the iron legs is the Roman Empire that was before Christ up to 400 AD. For 500 or 600 years there was the Roman Empire. And finally, the feet of iron clay, part of iron, like the legs right here, part of iron and part of clay. It keeps talking about how they were brittle. They're still part of the iron kingdom, but they're in the future because the verses relate to this future time of the 10 kings, when the key reference is when the eternal kingdom is set up, when the stone comes and crushes those feet. Okay? So that's the key ones there. So here at the top of the page, the people of the saints of highest will be given dominion. What is dominion? It's like rule, right? It's kind of like rule, right? You're given dominion, control over, okay? Then sovereignty, the dominion, and greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one, but the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom, possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come, until the ancient days came and gave judgment and passed favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So I'm thinking the saints are going to take possession of the kingdom. It hasn't happened yet, so these events are related to this future time. Okay? The highest one's everlasting kingdom, all the dominions will serve and obey him. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. That's the end of book of Revelation. That is the end of time. That's the everlasting kingdom. So I got 1 whole minute left. Does everybody have a question? I know I go really fast. And the book of Daniel. Yes?
Sorry, did you see here in the chapter 7 that in 2, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea.
Uh-huh.
And the 4 great beasts came up from the sea,
Right.
diverse from one another. And it says that the first was like a lion and had an eagle's wing.
Yeah.
I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth
Yeah.
and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So there's what I see, there's like winds from the heaven, then under the sea, like over the sea, and then from the earth they come. Those beasts, they come from the earth.
They come from the sea. It says that when you first read it, it said they come out of the great sea.
They come from the sea and they lift it up from the earth,
Yeah.
like, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and man's heart was given to you.
Right. So all it is beasts, and you're going like, well, I can't relate to beasts. So here's where Daniel's trying to relate the beast to humanity. He's trying to show that it has to do with humans, okay? Now, I'd rather have it that he didn't do all the beasts and all of the creatures and all that, you know? But like I always say, I don't get to decide, right? It's not my decision. No one called me up, centuries ago and say, Kevin, what do you think, It's just me responding to what the text says. So those beasts have human qualities. They are like humans. They stand up and they do those things. So that's a good point. And then the thing I didn't mention is the wings represent of the beast their swiftness, their ability to move around quickly. Like Alexander the Great, in a few years, quickly conquered the whole world. And then he died in his early 30s. He quickly did that. So whenever you have wings, it's usually about the swiftness of that beast's ability or that kingdom's ability to accomplish what they do accomplish. So I'll close in prayer so we can.
In antiquity, those the lion, the bear, and the leopard are connected to those kingdoms. They're artifacts that in Babylon.
Oh, yeah.
And the bear is associated with Persia. They found statues and things like
Is that some of that's in Germany where they've transported that stuff into Germany? That famous museum?
Babylonian tower.
Yeah, some of that's there, yeah. Pretty interesting. So anyway, yeah, I could have spent 3 times as much on this, but this is all you get this morning, so. Father, we thank you for this time and all you revealed to us in prophecy, especially through Daniel this morning. Fathers, help us have insight to these things, not assume things, but actually study and literally try to understand the best we can all of these prophecies and how they relate to what's already happened and how they relate to the future. And Father, how that affects us and our coming into the future eternal kingdom with you. We thank you for all these things. In Jesus' name, amen.